My husband passed away and my son shouted in my face, "Today, it's you." I was born in the summer of 1953 in a modest house tucked into a quiet neighborhood of Laredo, Texas, where the heat clung to the walls and the desert wind carried stories from both sides of the border. My earliest memories are of sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the smell of sawdust and fresh bread, and my mother's humming floating through the rooms like a gentle spell. My father worked with his hands, shaping wood into furniture so beautiful it felt alive, each curve deliberate, each joint patient. My mother sewed dresses for neighbors and strangers alike, her fingers quick and precise, transforming bolts of fabric into garments meant for celebrations. We did not have luxury, but we had warmth, routine, and affection in abundance, and I grew up believing that love alone could shield a family from anything. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. There was, however, a shadow that lingered at the edges of our family history, a story adults spoke of in hushed tones when they thought children were not listening. My great-grandfather on my father's side had been a troubled man, prone to long sleepless nights and terrifying beliefs that bent his perception of reality. They said he once believed his own sister was something else entirely, something dangerous wearing a familiar face. The incident ended before tragedy occurred, but it left scars that time never quite erased. My grandmother would whisper that whatever plagued him had skipped a generation, that it had not touched her children or grandchildren. As a child, I accepted that explanation easily. The past felt distant, sealed away like an old photograph tucked into a drawer no one opened anymore. I grew up happy, walking to school with my older sister, playing in the street until dusk, listening to my father's bedtime stories and falling asleep to my mother's quiet singing. By the time I finished high school in the early 1970s, the world felt full of promise. I found work as a secretary at a small accounting firm downtown, earning just enough to help at home and still afford little pleasures that made me feel grown, like a new shade of lipstick or sandals for summer. It was there, among stacks of paper and ringing telephones, that I met the man who would become the center of my world. Felipe arrived at the office carrying more files than he could manage, his balance failing just as our paths crossed. I reached out instinctively, our hands brushing as papers slid back into place. It was a simple moment, insignificant on the surface, yet something in it shifted the air around us. He smiled, apologetic and warm, introducing himself as the new accountant. His voice was calm, his eyes a striking shade that caught the light, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I could not explain. For weeks afterward, we exchanged polite glances and quiet conversations until he finally asked me to see a movie. I said yes without hesitation. Our courtship was slow and respectful, shaped by the customs of the time. Felipe visited my parents' home, spoke with my father, and treated me with a gentleness that felt rare even then. We walked in parks, shared ice cream, attended festivals, and spoke endlessly about the future. He listened in a way that made me feel seen, remembered details I mentioned casually, and spoke of dreams with a steadiness that made them feel attainable. When he asked me to marry him in 1975, kneeling in my parents' living room with a simple ring and trembling hands, my answer was immediate. The joy in his eyes mirrored my own, and for the first time I felt truly certain of where my life was going. Our wedding was modest but filled with love, a gathering shaped by family effort rather than money. My mother and aunt cooked for days, my father built the cake table himself, and my dress was sewn by hands that loved me. When I walked down the aisle and saw Felipe waiting, his expression undone by emotion, I felt as though I were stepping into a future built on something solid and unbreakable. We began our married life in a small apartment near downtown, furnishing it slowly, filling it with plants, curtains, and laughter. It was not grand, but it was ours, and it felt like enough. From the beginning, we spoke of children. Felipe imagined teaching a son to fish and throw a ball, while I pictured a daughter learning family recipes. In truth, we wanted only a healthy child, someone to love and guide. After a year of trying and quiet worry, that hope became real. When I told Felipe the first was pregnant, presenting him with tiny crocheted booties over dessert, his reaction was pure disbelief turned to joy. He held me as though afraid I might vanish, promising to be the best father he could possibly be. The months that followed were gentle ones. My pregnancy was uncomplicated, and Felipe doted on me with tireless devotion. When we learned we were having a boy, he shared the news with anyone who would listen, already planning a future for a child not yet born. We painted a small room blue, assembled a crib my father made by hand, and filled drawers with tiny clothes sewn by family. By the time labor came in January of 1978, we were ready in every way we knew how to be. Our son arrived after long hours, red-cheeked and strong, his dark hair thick against his head. Holding him for the first time, I felt a love so vast it frightened me. Felipe wept openly beside me, his voice breaking as he whispered that our child was perfect. We named him Michael, and from the moment we brought him home, our world reshaped itself around his presence. Nights were sleepless, days blurred together, yet every small milestone felt monumental. Felipe embraced fatherhood completely, returning from work eager to hold his son, speak to him, and marvel at his every expression. Michael grew quickly, not only in size but in awareness. Even as a toddler, he seemed unusually alert, watching the world with an intensity that drew comments from neighbors and teachers. By preschool, his vocabulary and curiosity set him apart. He asked questions endlessly, absorbing information with an appetite that amazed us. Felipe encouraged this curiosity, bringing home books and puzzles, answering questions thoughtfully, and never dismissing his son's intelligence. Our routines settled into a comfortable rhythm, shaped by work, school, and evenings spent together at home. When Michael was 3, we moved into a larger house with a yard and space to grow. The transition felt like a reward for years of effort, a sign that life was unfolding as planned. Michael thrived in school, making friends easily, impressing teachers, and spending hours reading or building elaborate worlds from blocks on the living room floor. He was affectionate, polite, and imaginative, a child who seemed both joyful and thoughtful beyond his years. There were moments, though small and fleeting, that unsettled me in ways I could not name at the time. Once at the beach, an older boy destroyed something Michael had built. Instead of crying, my son reacted with a calm intensity that felt out of place, his eyes fixed and his words oddly measured. The incident passed quickly, dismissed as childish anger, yet the memory lingered with me long after. I told myself it meant nothing, that children sometimes surprised us, and I chose not to dwell on it. As years passed, Felipe's career flourished. He opened his own accounting firm, working tirelessly to build something lasting. Michael admired his father deeply, spending time at the office, learning the basics of the work, and speaking of joining the business one day. We felt proud, hopeful, and secure, convinced that whatever challenges life held, we were equipped to face them together. Looking back now, I recognize those years as a fragile kind of peace, bright and full, yet standing unknowingly on the edge of something far darker. Those years after Michael's early childhood passed in what felt like a gentle, dependable rhythm. Our house was filled with school projects taped to the refrigerator, birthday cards tucked into drawers, and the sound of Felipe's laughter drifting through the hallway after long workdays. Michael excelled at school with an ease that sometimes startled his teachers. He devoured books meant for children twice his age, asked questions that forced adults to pause before answering, and carried himself with a seriousness that made him seem older than his peers. At home, he could be tender and playful, yet there was always an intensity beneath the surface, a depth that made him different without yet making him strange. When Michael turned 10, we celebrated in a way we never had before. Felipe's business had grown enough that we could afford a real party, complete with decorations and a cake too large for our dining table. Michael's smile that day was radiant, his joy contagious, and as I watched him surrounded by friends, I felt certain we had done something right as parents. That night, after the guests left and the house settled into quiet again, Felipe held my hand and said life felt generous. I agreed. It felt as though the future was opening its arms to us. As Michael entered adolescence, his brilliance sharpened. He became fascinated by subjects most teenagers avoided, losing himself in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He would spend hours in his room, emerging only to eat or to ask questions that caught me off guard. Sometimes he spoke as though he were thinking aloud, connecting ideas in ways I struggled to follow. Felipe admired this fiercely, convinced our son was destined for something extraordinary. I shared his pride, though occasionally I felt a flicker of unease when Michael seemed too withdrawn, too absorbed in his own thoughts. By the time he was 15, Michael began helping Felipe at the office on weekends. He showed a natural aptitude for organization and numbers, absorbing processes quickly, asking questions that demonstrated a keen understanding of systems and logic. Felipe glowed with pride, talking about the future as though it were already written. I listened, smiling, even as a small voice inside me whispered caution. I told myself it was just a mother's instinct, an unnecessary worry fueled by old family stories I had never truly believed. The first undeniable change came quietly, without drama. Michael began sleeping less. I would wake at night and see light under his door, hear the faint scratch of a pen moving across paper. When I asked, he brushed me off, saying he was studying or thinking. His room, once meticulously organized, grew cluttered. His appetite faded, meals left unfinished. When I pressed him gently, he bristled, irritation flashing across his face in a way I had never seen before. Felipe insisted it was adolescence, stress, the pressure we had placed on him without meaning to. Then came the calls from school. Teachers spoke of erratic behavior, sudden absences, moments of brilliance followed by stretches of disengagement. Michael, once eager to participate, now interrupted lessons with comments that made little sense to others. When confronted, he denied anything was wrong, his voice tight with resentment. I recognized fear beneath the anger, though I could not yet name it. The visit to the doctor felt surreal, as though we were playing roles in someone else's life. Tests showed nothing physically wrong. The suggestion of psychiatric evaluation landed between Felipe and me like a dropped plate, shattering something delicate. Felipe resisted the idea fiercely at first, his voice cracking as he insisted our son was not broken. I insisted, haunted by memories of whispered stories from my childhood. When Michael finally agreed to see a specialist, his sudden calm unsettled me more than his earlier resistance. I saw it then, unmistakably, the emptiness in his gaze that mirrored descriptions I had heard of my great-grandfather. The realization struck with a force that stole my breath. Something ancient and hidden had awakened in my son, something I had prayed would never surface. The diagnosis came carefully, wrapped in clinical language meant to soften its impact. Psychotic symptoms, delusions, hallucinations. Words that felt unreal even as they explained everything. Medication helped at first, dulling the sharp edges of Michael's agitation. He slept, ate, and returned to school tentatively. Hope bloomed again, fragile but real. We traveled to Dallas seeking a second opinion, desperate for reassurance. Instead, we received confirmation. The illness had a name, a prognosis, and a permanence I struggled to accept. We returned home carrying prescriptions and instructions, trying to pretend our lives could still resemble what they once were. For a while, it seemed possible. Michael stabilized, though side effects weighed heavily on him. He complained of feeling slowed, disconnected from himself. When I discovered he had stopped taking his medication, fear tightened around my chest. His words grew sharper, his thoughts more tangled, his accusations more frightening. One night, he lashed out physically, convinced we were not who we claimed to be. The look in his eyes that night was one I will never forget. It was not my son's gaze, but something wild and desperate, driven by terror I could not reach. Hospitalization became unavoidable. The decision felt like betrayal, though reason told me it was necessary. Leaving Michael in that sterile hallway, listening to his cries fade behind closed doors, carved something hollow inside me. Felipe and I returned home to a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. We clung to each other, repeating that we had done the right thing, though neither of us truly believed it yet. Michael improved under structured care. Each visit brought cautious optimism. He apologized, expressed remorse, and promised to comply with treatment. We allowed ourselves to hope again, planning a future that accommodated his condition rather than denied it. Then Felipe died. The call came before dawn, tearing me from sleep and from the life I knew. The words barely registered at first. I remember staring at the wall, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something less final. They never did. Felipe was gone, taken by senseless violence far from where he should have been. The world tilted, and nothing felt solid again. Telling Michael was like breaking glass with my bare hands. His reaction frightened me more than grief would have. He withdrew into himself, speaking of warnings and voices, of inevitability. The illness surged back with brutal force, and once again I faced the impossible choice of hospitalization. Grief and guilt tangled together until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of funeral arrangements, paperwork, and hospital visits. I moved through them as though underwater, performing tasks without feeling present. At night, alone in our apartment, I listened to the city hum outside the window and wondered how I was supposed to survive this fractured version of my life. I had lost my husband, my partner, the man who anchored me. My son was slipping further from reach, pulled into a world I could not follow. When Michael was discharged again, he was quieter, dulled by medication and sorrow. I reorganized our lives around routine, structure, and vigilance. The future shrank to manageable units of time. Meals, appointments, sleep. I abandoned dreams of normal milestones and focused instead on stability. It was exhausting, isolating work, yet it gave me purpose when everything else had fallen away. The night I woke to find Michael standing beside my bed holding a knife, his expression blank and searching, something inside me finally broke. I calmed him, disarmed him, and sat awake until dawn, listening to his breathing and my own heart pounding. By morning, I knew I could not do this alone anymore. Loving my son meant admitting my limits. Placing him in a therapeutic residence felt like surrender, though doctors assured me it was not. I visited daily, watched him adapt slowly, watched myself age prematurely under the weight of constant worry. Time passed, measured in progress reports and medication adjustments. Gradually, the crises softened. Michael found expression through art, pouring confusion and emotion onto canvas in ways words never allowed. Watching him paint was like watching him breathe more freely. Years passed. I learned how to live with absence, how to redefine family, how to find meaning in small victories. My son grew into a man shaped by illness yet not entirely defined by it. He remained fragile, unpredictable, and deeply human. And I remained his mother, bound to him by love stronger than fear, grief, or exhaustion. The nightmare had returned, just as I had feared, but it had not consumed everything. Not yet. Life did not suddenly become easier once Michael moved into the therapeutic residence, but it did become more predictable. The days no longer carried the sharp edge of constant fear that one wrong word or one missed sign could erupt into catastrophe. Instead, they unfolded in careful sequences of visits, meetings with doctors, medication schedules, and long conversations that hovered between hope and exhaustion. I learned to measure progress in increments so small they were nearly invisible, a clearer sentence here, a calmer afternoon there, a week without crisis. I returned to work at a medical clinic not far from where Michael lived, taking a position that required little emotional investment but offered structure. The routine anchored me. I answered phones, filed records, and greeted patients whose lives briefly intersected with mine without knowing the private storm I carried inside. During lunch breaks and after shifts, I drove to see my son, bringing him books, fruit, or sometimes just my presence. On good days, we walked the gardens together and talked about art, science, and memory. On bad days, I sat quietly beside him while his gaze wandered somewhere I could not follow. Time softened some wounds while deepening others. Grief for Felipe never disappeared, but it changed shape, settling into my bones like an old ache that flared unexpectedly. Michael's illness, too, evolved. The hallucinations lost some of their intensity, though they never vanished completely. He learned to question them, to recognize patterns, to ask for help before fear overwhelmed him. This awareness did not cure him, but it gave him a fragile foothold in reality. Art became his refuge. At first, It was simply another therapeutic activity suggested by his doctors, something to occupy his hands and mind. Soon, it became more than that. He painted obsessively, pouring hours into canvases filled with color and movement. The images were abstract, unsettling and powerful, often reflecting inner landscapes that words failed to describe. Watching him work, I saw a version of my son that felt intact, focused, and alive. The illness receded slightly while he painted, granting him moments of clarity that felt miraculous. When his work began attracting attention beyond the residents, I felt a cautious joy mixed with fear. Recognition brought pride, but also pressure. We navigated this carefully, limiting exposure, ensuring he remained grounded. Small exhibitions followed, each one a step into a world that had once felt permanently closed to him. I watched strangers admire his work without knowing his history, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that held more than survival. Yet stability remained fragile. Stress, change, and loss could still trigger setbacks. I learned to read Michael's moods as one might read the weather, sensing shifts before they became storms. There were hospitalizations, moments of regression, and nights when I lay awake wondering how long I could continue like this. The question of my own aging loomed quietly in the background. I worried about what would happen to Michael when I was no longer able to care for him, when my strength inevitably waned. The years rolled forward, marked by birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet milestones. Michael turned 30, then 35, each year bringing subtle changes. He matured in ways I had not expected, developing patience and empathy born from suffering. He spoke openly about his condition in controlled settings, offering insight that surprised even his doctors. His paintings grew more refined, his exhibitions more frequent, and though he never lived entirely independently, he carved out a place in the world that belonged to him. Then came the fall. It was an ordinary morning, unremarkable in every way. I slipped on a bathroom mat and felt a sharp pain explode through my ankle. The injury was serious enough to immobilize me for weeks, and suddenly the roles we had settled into shifted abruptly. Michael insisted on caring for me, his determination fierce and unwavering. At first, he managed admirably, attending to my needs with a focus that bordered on rigid. He prepared meals, monitored medication times, and helped me navigate the apartment. I was proud of him, deeply so, but I sensed the strain beneath his resolve. The responsibility weighed heavily, pulling at threads that had taken years to stabilize. His sleep grew restless, his movements more tense. Conversations with unseen figures crept back into the edges of our days. I tried to minimize my needs, but injury does not yield to pride. The introduction of outside help was both a relief and a revelation. The caregiver's presence eased the pressure on Michael, creating space for him to breathe. I watched as he relaxed in ways I had not realized he needed, engaging with her easily, unburdened by the emotional weight that came with caring for me. It was then I understood how tightly our lives were intertwined, how love alone could sometimes intensify strain rather than relieve it. With time, my ankle healed, and Michael's equilibrium returned. The episode left a lasting impression on both of us. It forced me to confront my own vulnerability and his limitations with renewed honesty. We talked openly about boundaries, support, and the necessity of shared care. It was not an easy conversation, but it was necessary. As the years progressed, Michael continued to find meaning through his art and advocacy. He spoke at small events about mental health, offering perspective drawn from lived experience. People listened. Some saw him only as an artist, others as a survivor. I saw him as my son, shaped by forces neither of us had chosen, yet still capable of growth, connection, and contribution. I aged quietly, the lines on my face deepening alongside my understanding of resilience. The house is filled with Michael's paintings, each one a testament to persistence. Visitors commented on their intensity, unaware of the decades of struggle behind them. I no longer felt the need to explain. Our story belonged to us. Looking back, I recognize how fear once dictated so many of my choices. Fear of the past repeating itself, fear of losing my son entirely, fear of being alone. Those fears never vanished, but they loosened their grip as I learned to live alongside them rather than beneath them. Love did not cure illness, but it sustained us through it. Michael still has difficult days. The illness remains unpredictable and demanding. But he also has laughter, friendships, purpose, and moments of peace. I have learned to cherish those moments without clinging to them, knowing impermanence is woven into every life. The nightmare returned, yes, but it did not claim everything. It reshaped us, altered our path, and demanded more strength than I ever believed I possessed. And still, we endured. Not because we were extraordinary, but because love, stubborn and imperfect, refused to let go. As Michael entered his 40s, life settled into something that resembled calm, though I had learned never to call it peace without hesitation. Calm implied permanence, and nothing in our experience had ever stayed fixed for long. Instead, what we had was balance, delicate and constantly adjusted, like a mobile hanging from the ceiling, swaying with every small movement of air. Some days required only gentle correction. Others demanded all the strength I had left. My own body began reminding me that time does not pause out of courtesy. The energy I once had in abundance became something I had to ration carefully. Long walks tired me. Nights passed more slowly. I began to notice the quiet fear behind Michael's eyes whenever I mentioned a doctor's appointment of my own. He never said it directly, but I knew he worried about what would happen if I were no longer there to anchor him. That unspoken question lived between us, heavy and unavoidable. We began planning in small, practical ways. Legal documents were updated. Care plans were reviewed. Trusted names were written down. These preparations were painful, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. 4 years, we had lived in survival mode, responding to crises as they came. Planning for a future beyond me felt like an act of faith, an acknowledgement that Michael's life did not end with my own. Michael resisted these conversations at first. He grew quiet whenever the topic arose, retreating into himself. Eventually, one evening as we sat surrounded by his paintings, he spoke. He said he did not want to imagine a world without me. I told him I understood, that I felt the same about imagining a world without him. We sat in silence after that, holding hands like we had when he was a child, letting the weight of reality settle without trying to escape it. Art continued to be his lifeline. The themes in his work shifted as he aged, becoming less chaotic, more reflective. The colors softened. The shapes grew deliberate. When I asked him about the change, he said his mind felt quieter now, not silent, but calmer. The voices, when they appeared, were less commanding, more distant. They still frightened him, but they no longer controlled him. That distinction mattered more than any diagnosis ever could. He began mentoring younger artists through a small community program connected to mental health advocacy. Watching him guide others, offering reassurance drawn from his own experiences, filled me with a pride that words fail to capture. He spoke honestly about his illness, not as a tragedy, but as a reality he lived with every day. People listened because he spoke with authenticity, not pity. For the first time, I saw him not just surviving, but contributing. My role shifted again, subtly but significantly. I was no longer just a caregiver or protector. I became a witness. I watched my son carve out a life that did not depend entirely on me, even as we remained deeply connected. That transition was both beautiful and painful. Letting go, even partially, required trust one had spent decades learning to cultivate. There were setbacks, of course. Stress still found its way in, sometimes through loss, sometimes through unexpected change. A close friend from the residence passed away suddenly, triggering a period of grief that unsettled Michael's stability. For weeks, he withdrew, speaking less, painting darker images. I stayed close, resisting the urge to panic, trusting the skills he had learned. Slowly, he resurfaced, scarred but standing. As for me, grief revisited often, especially in quiet moments. Felipe's absence remained a constant undercurrent in my life. Sometimes I caught myself turning to tell him something, only to remember again that he was gone. The pain no longer knocked the air from my lungs, but it lingered like an old bruise, tender to the touch. I learned that love does not fade simply because the person it belonged to is no longer present. One afternoon, sorting through old boxes, I found letters Felipe had written me early in our marriage. Reading his words, filled with hope and certainty, I cried for the woman I had been then, untested and unaware. Yet I also felt gratitude. Loving him had shaped me, strengthened me, prepared me for battles I never imagined. In that sense, he was still with me, woven into every decision I made. Michael noticed the letters spread across the table and asked about them. We spent the afternoon reading together, laughing softly at Felipe's handwriting and his earnest declarations. Michael listened carefully, absorbing stories of his father not as a figure from illness-blurred memory, but as a real man, flawed and kind. That sharing felt like healing, a bridge between past and present. The years continued their steady march forward. I retired from work, adjusting to days that felt too long and too quiet at first. Gradually, I filled them with routines that brought meaning. Walks in the morning, cooking meals slowly, tending to small plants by the window. Michael remained active, balancing independence with support. He traveled occasionally for exhibitions, always returning home with stories and exhaustion that reminded me how much effort his stability required. As my 72nd birthday approached, I found myself reflecting more than usual. Longevity brings clarity, stripping away illusions. I saw my life not as a series of tragedies, but as a continuum shaped by love, loss, resilience, and adaptation. I had not been spared hardship, but I had not been defeated by it either. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, Michael sat beside me and asked if I regretted anything. The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. I told him I regretted not asking for help sooner, not trusting others when I needed support. I regretted the nights I spent blaming myself for things beyond my control. But I did not regret loving him fiercely, or choosing to stay, or believing that his life was worth fighting for. He nodded, absorbing this quietly. Then he said something I will carry with me always. He said my belief had been his anchor when his own mind betrayed him. That even on his darkest days, some part of him remembered that someone saw him as more than his illness. Hearing that made every sleepless night, every painful decision, every moment of fear feel justified. We sat together until the light faded, comfortable in silence. The world outside continued, indifferent to our reflections, yet within our small space, something felt complete. Not perfect but whole. I do not know how many years I have left. None of us do. But I know this. My story is not defined solely by suffering. It is defined by endurance, by adaptation, by love that refuses to disappear even when tested beyond reason. Michael's story is not one of defeat, but of persistence. Together, we learned that life does not need to follow the path we imagined to still hold meaning. The nightmare returned, yes. It arrived uninvited and stayed longer than anyone deserved. But it did not take everything. It left room for art, connection, growth, and quiet moments of grace. And as long as those remain, the story is not over. Below is part 5, the final section. He continues seamlessly, remains pure narrative paragraphs, fully original and copyright-free, and is written to the same tone and pacing at approximately 2,300 words. In the later years, time began to move differently for me. Days felt longer, yet years slipped by with alarming speed. I noticed it most in small things, the way my hands stiffened in the mornings, the way Michael watched me more closely than he once had, as if memorizing my movements. Roles had shifted again without ceremony. I was no longer simply his mother or his anchor. I was someone he worried about, someone he measured his stability against. That realization carried both tenderness and weight. We spoke openly about the future in ways we never had before. Not with fear, but with realism. Michael understood his condition better than anyone else ever could. He knew what he needed to remain well and where his limits lay. Together, we worked with professionals to ensure continuity of care beyond my lifetime. Those conversations were difficult, but they also strengthened something between us. They confirmed that our bond was not based on dependency alone, but on mutual respect and trust. Michael continued to paint, though less obsessively now, choosing quality over quantity. His work evolved again, becoming quieter, more contemplative. Viewers often described his newer pieces as peaceful, even hopeful. When I told him this, he smiled softly and said peace was something he had learned to value precisely because it never came easily. His exhibitions were no longer rare events but steady occurrences within certain circles. He was never famous, but he was known, and more importantly, he was understood. I found comfort in routines shaped around simple joys. Morning light through the window. The smell of coffee. The gentle hum of the city waking up. I learned to rest without guilt, to accept help without shame. Michael encouraged this, reminding me that strength also meant knowing when to slow down. Watching him offer that wisdom felt like witnessing a full circle I once thought impossible. There were moments when the past returned sharply, uninvited. A song on the radio. A familiar street name. A memory of Felipe laughing in the kitchen. Grief never disappears completely. It changes, becomes quieter, more private. I spoke to Felipe often in my thoughts, updating him on our son's life, on the resilience that had grown where despair once lived. I liked to believe he would be proud, that he would recognize the man Michael had become. Michael sometimes spoke of his father too, not in the fragmented way illness once forced upon him, but with clarity and warmth. He remembered lessons Felipe taught him, values he carried forward. In those moments, I saw how love can outlast death, how presence does not require a body to endure. The connection remained, intact and meaningful. As I reached my 70s, I felt an urge to speak, to share our story beyond the quiet rooms and familiar faces. Not for sympathy, but for understanding. Too many families suffer in silence, burdened by stigma and fear. Too many parents believe they have failed when illness strikes their children. I wanted to say that survival does not always look like victory, and that meaning can exist even when dreams collapse. That is why I began telling this story, piece by piece, memory by memory. It was not easy. Reopening old wounds never is. But each word felt like a release, a way of honoring what we endured and what we became. I spoke not as an expert, but as a mother who learned through pain, patience, and persistence. Michael supported this decision in his own quiet way. He said that if our experience helped even one family feel less alone, it would be worth it. Hearing that confirmed what I had always known. Despite everything, his heart remained gentle, thoughtful, and deeply human. The illness had not taken that from him. Today, my house is filled with his paintings. They line the walls, each one a chapter of a life lived in fragments and moments of clarity. Visitors often ask about them, and I tell them proudly that my son is an artist. I do not always mention schizophrenia unless it feels necessary. His work stands on its own, and so does he. Michael lives nearby now, close enough that I see him often, independent enough to maintain his own rhythm. We share meals, conversations, and long silences that no longer feel heavy. I know there will be challenges ahead. Illness does not retire. Aging does not reverse. But I also know we are not facing these things unprepared or alone. When I look back across my life, I see love as the constant thread. Love that began in a modest house filled with fabric and sawdust. Love that grew through marriage, motherhood, and loss. Love that adapted when the world demanded it change shape. It was never perfect, never sufficient on its own to prevent suffering, but it endured. The nightmare returned, yes. It tested every belief I held about family, safety, and destiny. But it did not define us. What defined us was the refusal to let fear make our decisions, the willingness to seek help, and the courage to imagine a future even when the present felt unbearable. I am older now. My body carries the evidence of years lived fully and painfully. But my heart is steady. I have seen darkness and survived it. I have watched my son fall and rise in ways few people ever witness. And I have learned that life, even when broken, can still be meaningful. If there is one thing I want others to take from this story, it is this. Mental illness does not erase a person's worth. It does not negate love. It does not eliminate the possibility of growth, connection, or purpose. It demands patience, humility, and support, but it does not own the whole story. I sit here now, watching the evening light settle softly around me, grateful for what remains. Grateful for my son, for the art that fills our lives, for the resilience we discovered when we had no other choice. And grateful for the simple truth that even after unimaginable loss, life can still offer moments of grace. This is not a story of triumph in the traditional sense. It is a story of persistence. Choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Of finding meaning not in perfection, but in presence. And of believing, even on the hardest days, that love is reason enough to continue. No matter how dark the night becomes, the sun does rise. Sometimes quietly, sometimes slowly, but it rises all the same.